Welcome to Red, White, and Blue. From the right, I'm Gary Polland.
And from the left, I'm David Jones.
Tonight we welcome the author of The Texas Challenge and America Challenged, Steve Murdock, Rice University Professor of Sociology and the Director of Rice University's Hobby Center for the Study of Texas. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Very, very glad to be here, and thanks for inviting me.
So he has a big state to provide us information about, Gary, so we need to get into the real facts.
I agree.
You know,
Okay.
Steve, we've got the last decade of numbers to look at, and, interestingly, you having been an appointee of a certain president to head up a Census Bureau, uniquely qualified to tell us how has Texas changed in the last decade.
Well, Texas has had the most dramatic growth in numerical terms in its history. Almost 4.3 million people added to our population. Put it in perspective, California is 12 million larger than we are, and it grew by 900,000 less than we did. So this is one of the fastest growing, in numerical terms, the fastest growing, but also one of the faster growing periods in terms of percentage increases. On the other hand, the country, although it grew by about 27.3 million people, had the second slowest growing period in its history. Only the Great Depression period, as measured in the 1940 census, was a slower rate of growth. So Texas has stood out in a number of ways, and of course now has 3 of the 10 largest cities. And in fact, San Antonio, the 7th largest city, had the largest numerical increase of any one of the 10 largest cities. With 1.3 million people, it actually had more population growth than New York with 6.2 million.
So what are the areas of the state where the growth has been located?
Growth has been concentrated for really about 30 years in 4 parts of Texas. There's what we often call the Texas Triangle, Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, over to San Antonio and Austin, and then the Valley of Texas, particularly in Odago County and when you get down to McAllen and Harlingen, that area of Texas. Those areas this decade accounted for 85% of all growth in the state.
And who are these people that are coming into this population that you're identifying in terms of an ethnic breakdown?
Well, the growth this decade, like the last decade, in fact, even in the 1990s we saw it, are increasingly diverse in the sense that they are something other than non-Hispanic white, or to use the Texas term Anglo. This decade, about 10.8% of the net increase was Anglo. 65% was Hispanic, and then you had 10 to 15% each from the Asian and African American populations. What's interesting about that, though, is that it's no longer a Texas phenomenon. It's a national phenomenon. If you took the total growth in the country, what you found is that for the country as a whole, the proportion of its growth due to the Anglo population was 8.3%. It was actually less than the amount in Texas. The amount due to the Hispanic population was 55% of the net population growth. And it gets the younger the population, the greater the preponderance of minority populations.
Is that happening, Professor, because Anglos are not having children, or is this as a result of immigration, both legal and illegal?
Well, one of the things that I always like to inform people of is that there's a lot of misunderstanding. I'll have people say, well, you've got a lot of growth in Texas, but you Texans, when immigration goes away, you're going to not have much population growth. In Texas, in the data we have through 2009, we don't have the last birth year of 2010, 54% of our growth was natural increase, excess of births over deaths. Another 21% was immigration from other parts of the country. And the remaining 24% was about 14% from undocumented immigration, and the other 11% from documented immigration. So immigration is the smallest part of Texas growth. It is the smallest part of U.S. population growth, particularly if you're worried about the immigration, whether it's undocumented or legal.
Now, you mentioned the significant growth that Texas has undergone this last decade, and we're certainly maybe on our way, if the trends continue, of eclipsing California at some point. But with growth come challenges. What have you identified in your work the biggest challenges Texas faces, let's say, for the next decade because of all the growth we've had?
Well, I think the challenge in the sense of how do you take the populations that you're getting, how do you make them productive in terms of the economy, economically and otherwise, is the challenge we have in education. We do not rank well in education. We rank 50th among the states in the percent of our population that's high school graduates. We're 42nd or 43rd on per capita expenditures for education in Texas. Yet all the data we have, going back to when we first started to measure this, show that the single best indicator, the single best predictor of income is education, for the population as a whole. And that doesn't mean there aren't people that are 8th grade dropouts that are fantastically wealthy, or people at the other end who are not begging on the street. But the reality of it is that education is the key, has been the key for generation after generation to make that climb from the bottom to the middle and to the top. And that's very critical for Texas.
Well, you actually say, Steve, if I remember correctly, that we are in a downward spiral in your view, that we're not globally competitive, or that we will not be. So how dramatic is this problem for Texas' future?
Well, the question is what we do about it. In other words, what do we do about the demographic changes that we have? And we can go one of two ways. If we fail to meet the challenge, that's why the title of the 2 books that we have, we will be a poorer and less competitive state. We will be racing towards some of the states we don't like to use as references. On the other hand, if we could harness this potential through education, we could be at a competitive advantage. We would have a younger population. We would have a multicultural population when the economy is increasingly international. Multilingual population, which again would be beneficial. And of course, being located where we are geographically, we would be well placed for the north-south kinds of trade. But we've got to meet that challenge. If we fail to meet that challenge, Texas will be poorer and less competitive.
And you talked about education. Isn't part of the problem with education is not necessarily spending money, but not spending money effectively? The people we attract to the teaching profession, which are certainly not always the best and the brightest, we have real issues that go across the board, not just here, I'm sure,
well,
around the country.
I think the other part of this is that I find us, when I talk to groups, education groups, and others, I find us very schizophrenic when it comes to education. We will say, on the one hand, teachers aren't very good. And then on the other hand, we'll say, well, I don't have to pay teachers that much. I'll use a personal example. I have a brother who's a retired science and math teacher. Retired after 37 years, 3 master's degrees, small state, twice science teacher of the year for the state of North Dakota. Admittedly a small state, but still quite an honor. When he retired, his children wrote to all of the people who had been in his classes, and he had this notebook this thick, full of letters that said, I'm vice president of a chemical company, I wouldn't be there. But when I was talking to him, I said, well, the kids could read that folder and the tears would come out of your eyes. And he said, yeah, that's. I said, well, but he said, I did fail in one of my goals. I said, what was that? He said, I was hoping one of the last couple of years I taught, I'd make $50,000 a year. $50,000 a year.
Which and especially the shortage we have for quality science teachers and math teachers in the public schools that are good is just astounding. In fact, one of the things I propose that I think we need to do, we need to start differentiating teacher salary. If you teach in these very difficult areas that are challenging, that you have to be smart to even get to pass all those classes in college to get where your brother was, you got to be paid significantly more. I mean, you make the point. You want really good teachers. You need to pay the good teachers really good money.
And we've got to stop thinking, I think, about education in ways that are based in the past in a number of ways. The dedicated school teacher that, didn't matter how much you paid him or her, they'd do whatever needed to be done. The reality of it is that many good teachers simply can't stay in the profession if they want to feed their family and they want to have a normal kind of middle-class existence. So, I tell a story having been in a presentation one time where a gentleman both talked to a person from a competing firm and said, well, we got old Joe, but you really had to pay a lot of money for him. And the other guy says, yeah, but you get what you pay for. And 10 minutes later says, I wouldn't want a teacher that was just in it for the money.
Wow.
I mean, we wouldn't say that about a banker, we wouldn't say that about an attorney, we wouldn't say that about various kinds of executives. When it comes to teachers, some way, we don't see a conflict when we say those kind of things. So
Gary and I both know what attorneys are interested in.
The part of that that is, I think a history that we have. But I do think that getting aside from that, however we do it, it is clear that education is the key here.
Well, who gets it in the state of Texas? You've just been involved in the legislative session, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I know you talked to the Mexican-American legislative group. You probably saw what I saw about Representative Eisler, who heads public education in the House, say, our future is not bright. I'm not happy with the cuts to pre-K and to the Texas scholarship. So he may not like it, but that's what just happened.
Well, I will say, and I'm trying not to be too political about things, but I'm very concerned about this last session. The cuts to education were drastic, and we're going to experience significant changes because of those. The best example of that, and this is a piece of legislation, in fact, that we provided some data to Senator Ellis and others that created the Texas Grants Program. This is a program that helps poor kids get through college. And it is one of the best sets of money we spend in the state of Texas. They cut it drastically. They came back with some additional funds. But the reality of it is we are going to, I think, it's not too melodramatic to use what Ray Paredes, who's the head of the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, said when he testified, which is he said, we are going to lose a generation of college graduates. And I think that's very likely. And we can't afford to lose a generation of college graduates in Texas, particularly in those groups that are the fastest growing and for which we're going to have to look in the long term for the economic welfare of the state.
So what you're saying is no one yet gets the message that there's a difference in the type of education product that comes out of the 6th Ward of Houston versus the kids in Westview who go to River Oaks Baptist or St. John's.
Well, no, I think they get that. The issue is among some how to fix it, which is more complicated than I think a lot of people want to make.
Because the fair question would be, are there enough good quality teachers who want to teach? I mean, what I found is that a lot of people that used to be teachers are going to law school. Are becoming accountants, working for business, and are not teaching. Like you said, like the way it used to be, the dedicated teachers have been around for a long time. It's not there anymore because it's not remunerative enough. But part of the problem is we pay everybody the same. And the teacher unions, the negative I feel about them is they basically homogenized education. It's all the same. Everybody gets the same whether you're good, bad, or indifferent, no matter what topics, whatever you teach. So we've got real issues. Part of the problem is, I think, in Texas, we weren't getting the bang for the buck. I think public looks at performance of these school districts around the state and is generally not very happy with what they've been getting.
Well,
as we've spent more money, maybe, and you're saying, well, maybe we're not spending it smartly, and then maybe we need to spend more. But I think the public rewards performance.
Well, I think the public fails to understand a lot of things, and I'll use a very crude analogy. If I said to your partner here, I said, you're going to manufacture cars, and I'm going to give you the steel for it, or whatever we make it out of now. Now, what I'm going to give you has been in other cars. It's been beaten up. It's been battered. It's been treated awfully. And you're going to make cars. I came to you and I said, I have the best new product you've ever seen. It's the newest synthetics. It works just wonderful. And so you did it. He did it. And we got done. I said, what's wrong with you? He's producing a wonderful car. Well, you're talking about kids who come into this with very different levels of preparation. Not because the parents don't care, but because the parents are working 12-hour days. They're working in very physically demanding things. They may not have the background themselves. And for that kind of situation, it's going to take extra work, and it's going to take time. You do not come out of those kind of situations. People forget, and again, we don't want to think of it all as immigrants. But look at how the Irish were talked about. Irish need not apply. We talked about the Germans that way. We talked about the Italians. I like to say they didn't call my relatives mixed because they loved them. They didn't call the Italians wops because they loved them, and they didn't call the Germans heinies because they loved them. When you look at, the paragon of tolerance, Benjamin Franklin, he wrote a tract when he was writing Poor Richard's Almanac. And he said these people would come to our colony, they would make their culture our culture, their language our language, and if allowed to continue to grow, they will forever change Pennsylvania as an English colony. We was talking about the Germans. And so, taking that group aside, those who have come up with very little exposure to education, very poor circumstances, are going to take, more resources and longer times. The trouble is that people think, and if they go to their schools or high schools one time, we all think that high school is just like it was when we graduated. That high school doesn't exist for most people in Texas that are in our age groups. That's changed a lot. And it's understanding where people are now and what they come with and disadvantages as well as advantages that are important. And that doesn't excuse poor performance. It doesn't say we shouldn't have a tremendous amount of evaluation and be careful that we're spending our money wisely. But it does say that the challenges are different than they were 30 years ago or 40 years ago.
Well, Professor Murdock, let's be candid, though. It is true that it's not yet all over for the Anglos. They have a majority in the Texas legislature. They enacted their best effort in terms of educating this population of minority kids, and they failed. And what they failed to do, and I'm sure you can back this up if you want, is to recognize that we have a fast-growing economy. We're now the second largest in the United States at $1.2 trillion, and our tax effort is like 4%. That's our state revenue that we bring in, which is nothing. It's dwarfed by what the feds give us. So as long as Republicans want to say, "Oh, we're an overtaxed state," we're doomed. If people accept that.
Yeah. Well, let me say a little bit about the initial quote that you came out with. That was really not something I said. I was speaking in a group, and the first person that asked a question got up and said, "Well, it sounds to me like you're saying it's basically over for Anglos." My response was, well, I guess you might look at it that way, but what I was really talking about was demographically, and that is fairly accurate. You look at Anglo populations, we've been low replacement fertility for 30 years. The average Anglo woman is 41 years of age in the United States, means they're not going to have a lot more children. And where are they going to get immigrants from? Europe. Europe is the oldest, slowest growing part of the world, and the only major region of the world that the United Nations projects to have an absolute decline in population between now and 2050. So we have two populations in America. We have two populations in Texas. One is an aging, literally off the end of the life table, set of Anglos, and the other is a young set of minorities. And the two need one another. We old, aging Anglos are going to need someone to help pay for our Medicare and help pay for our Social Security. They need help in getting the skills and education they need to be competitive. However you look at it, you can not like or like or whatever way you want to look at it, groups from various origins. But the reality of it is, for Texas, and increasingly for the country, is that their futures are tied to their non-Anglo population.
So why don't the Republicans?
And how well they do is
why don't the Republicans recognize that they have to get a majority at some point from that population of people?
I would argue that in some ways they may be short-sighted. I think there's a group of people right now, Tea Party people included, and I don't want to pick on the Tea Party, but I think there's a set of Americans out there, to use a quote from a friend I won't identify, who was my political person in Houston, in Washington. He was a person who had advised been chief of staff for 3 different Republican House members, and he said, these people are a set of angry old white people who feel like they're losing their country. They want to go right back to 1960, and they aren't going to be able to do that, but from their perspective, they've done everything right. They've worked hard, and about 10 years ago, they said to one another, a couple said, well, we'll retire in about 3 years. It's 10 years later, their retirement is worth less than it was 10 years ago. They're angry. They're saying, we got cheated. Somebody's got to be at blame. And I think that group has driven a lot of what's happened in politics in the country and what's happened in Texas. What I see is the reality is to see that we're going to have to change some of those conditions, but that the reality of it is if let's say you push the fastest growing groups aside, you do that to your own detriment, because if they're not educated, they will be a dependency on the state of Texas, not an advantage. We have in our hands the potential
to afford to do that. But I want to talk about other challenges for the growth that you've identified, because it's not just education. I mean, you've got water, you've got highways and infrastructure.
If you look at infrastructure of various kinds, and highways are a good example of that. And part of that is the way we've handled it. I mean, in Texas, the only way to get between two distances, even if it's here to downtown Houston, is to drive, right? We've been slow to pick up mass transits of various kinds, so that we're just barely getting started in our major cities, compared to, one of the great things about D.C. is the metro system, which, I didn't take a car when I was there and didn't need a car to do most of what I wanted to do. The same thing is true on natural resource planning. I lived for several years in San Antonio. It's a San Antonio whose water supply is, what it is. And they just had a couple inches of rain, so they're very pleased because they're about ready to go to stage 3 in their water crisis management.
Yeah, I noticed that. Just to be fair, is there a problem with short-term viewing of problems for the state that our leadership has done, that they don't look long-term? They're worried about the next election, which is now, a year away, and they don't focus on what could happen. Texas, to be fair, we could go through an 8-year drought. That could happen. It's not inconceivable.
We have a rainy day fund.
It'll be gone, David.
I think. And this is going to make me sound more aged than I am. But I was listening to a politician one day who was talking to a group informally, and he's been around a long time. He's not from here. But he said, we've always had, or many times in our history, we had people who really their highest ambition was to be involved in making Texas better. They didn't want to be president. They didn't want to be senator, etc. And he pointed specifically, and this is probably belays his party affiliation, but he said, we had people like Bill Hobby and people like Bob Bullock, for whom being lieutenant governor was the highest aspiration they had, and they wanted Texas to be better, and it was going to end there. They weren't worried about what they did being popular, so it made them unpopular, or unpopular rather, making them unpopular for higher offices. And we used to have those.
So you're saying
Ratliff was another example of that.
Bill Ratliff,
and maybe that's part of the problem we have, is that politics never ends now. It's 24/7, 365 days a year, and there's never a break between elections and governing.
Yeah,
that's always been the case, though. The question is, what are the priorities of the state? What are the priorities of the state? Photo ID bill, sanctuary cities, and sonograms for women?
Well, no. We had in those periods of time, and I'll brag a little bit on the founder of our center. You had Bill Hobby probably did more to set up the higher education system of Texas and help in its funding than one of as much as at least one of over 2 or 3 people who were instrumental in that. Similar, there were things that Bullock did that were important, and there were thought out long-term. In fact, one of the big users, and maybe that's why I like him, of the Texas Challenge work was Bob Bullock, who demanded that any staff member read it as the first thing they did the first week they were in office, something like that. But the point of it is that they had a longer-term view, and I do think what's happened is that I think the media is part of the short-term turnaround, always got to have something on, got to fill every minute. And I think that has made the whole process so reactive that the kind of time to step back and look at long-term issues is just hard to find and not very well practiced right now.
Are we going to have a congressional representation that reflects the demographics of the state after the redistricting that we have seen in the legislature comes around?
I don't think so. And there's a number of reasons for this. On pure populations, you could say, look, we added 4.2 million people. 2.8 million of them were Hispanic. Only about 500,000 were Anglo. So, if you want to look at that, you'd say, well, we're going to have 4, probably 3 of those at least should be a minority, and probably 2 to 3 should be Hispanic.
Well,
but there are 2 or 3 reasons why that won't be the case. One is the Hispanic population is quite young, so that when you look at voting age population, it's a different issue. And the other issue that has hurt Hispanics is that they have their citizenship rates are lower than other groups,
and their voter participation rate is lower also.
Yeah.
So
they less likely to register, less likely to vote, and all those things have carried in there. But clearly, in the long run, if we if we get to be a state like every other state where the population eventually comes to, the political delegation comes to reflect the population, we're going to have some changes over the long term. And I'm not sure that the two parties are necessarily positioning themselves to be in place successful
long term. I think that's the point, though. It is important to note that Republicans did elect 2 Hispanic congressmen last time, and we may indeed elect one now after these redistricting lines if they hold.
Yeah, well,
we can always hope that Gary's views prevail here.
We can, David.
We don't really know that it's going to happen yet. Hey, Steve Murdock, thanks for being with us.
Okay, thank you.
Great to have you. We invite you to visit our home online at HoustonPBS.org. Click on the local program bar at Red, White, and Blue. Read about the guests, watch the shows, a follow-up discussion. Until next time, get informed and get active.